Here at the Life Live Better podcast, we are true believers in the quality of Anchor by Spotify. We have been using Anchor since we first started our podcast, and now that we're halfway through our second season, we cannot imagine recording this podcast without it. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and then edit your podcast right from your computer or even your phone. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on all the listening platforms, like even Spotify and Apple. It's everything you need to make your podcast, and you can find it all in one place. But best of all, and oh so necessary when you're first starting out, it is completely free. So give it a try. Go download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm right now and get started. Hi, this is Paula.
And I'm Joseph, and you're listening to Life Lived Better.
We wanted to take a moment to let you know that the content and language on today's episode is for adult audiences, so please use your discretion while listening.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to this week's podcast. We're super excited that we had our first guest on the podcast. Paula went out on a little adventure and found him and reached out to him. And luckily, he got back to us and we got a chance to speak with him. So why don't you tell us a little bit about him, Paula?
Yeah, I was so excited that he said yes. I am kind of a crime junkie, and that's where I found Collier. He's the subject in Investigation Discovery's documentary, A Murder in Mansfield. And I saw that and thought it was just an incredible story. When Collier was only 12 years old, his father, Jack Boyle, murdered his mother, and his father is now serving life in prison.
It's truly an amazing story. Well, let's jump into part one of this conversation.
We are so grateful you agreed to be with us today. When I saw your documentary, A Murder in Mansfield, I thought you would be perfect for this show to talk about some of the trauma you experienced, obviously really deep trauma, and how you deal with it on a regular basis. You came in when Joseph and I were talking about using humor to deal with trauma and just kind of dark days.
So funny that you should say that, because one of the things, I don't know if it's still in the documentary or not, but it was in the original, and I said it. And when I said it, I was like, no. I was saying self-deprecating, because I sort of like, I guess it's maybe a trauma response. Is like I have a lot of self-deprecation in my humor sometimes, like kind of, and I think that probably is, as I'm learning more about this, is a trauma response.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of saying I'm being self-deprecating, I said I'm being self-defecating.
That's good. If only it would have been a comedy.
But I'm just talking in a natural flow, and nobody interrupted me or anything like that. And then it was after, and I said, well, how was the edit? It was like, well, there's a couple, like, you did say self-defecating, and I was like, oh my god. Oh my god. And I don't know if it's still in there or what, or I think I did ADR on it or something, but it was just really funny. And it was like, I don't care. I mean, like, if that's the worst thing that happens, like, okay, we're good. We're good.
That's awesome. Good memories, though.
Oh, for sure. And I talk about it when I tell stories about the documentary. People are like, I think somebody commented on TikTok or something, and they say, oh, that's hilarious. And I'm like, yeah, because it is. It's really funny. It's really self-deprecating.
That's very good. We talk all the time about how much we use humor just to get through, just life in general, and then just like third-hand trauma from the stories we hear from our clients and stuff. Life is tough, and humor gets me through. So
I think that's one of the interesting things is when you look at like, I work in the entertainment industry, right? And so I think when you look at comedians, and I have a lot of humor. A lot of people say when they listen to my podcast, you have a really good sense of humor. Like, your humor is really good. And it's interesting because I have this sort of sardonic sense of humor, and a lot of people don't understand, like, that was my mother's sense of humor. My mother was a little dark and sardonic and had a very dry wit. And I mean, so much so that, like, the night that she was murdered, she was on the phone with her best friend, and she said, oh, well, he just pulled up with his mother, so he's not going to kill me tonight. Literally, like, one of her last things that she, like, my mother would always say famous last words. Like, that was her expression, famous last words.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah.
And when you think about stuff like that, and I laugh about it, and some people are like, wow, how can you laugh about that? I'm like, because what else am I going to do? Cry, hide in a corner. And it's, so you mentioned the documentary A Murder in Mansfield. And, there's, I think one of the things is, obviously you came to find me that way, right? So I think one of the interesting things is, I live in Santa Monica, and when I moved into this particular building, word got around, oh, he did this and this and this, and and one of my neighbors comes outside, and he's just like staring at me as I'm walking my dog, but like he wants to say something, and I'm like, oh, okay, and I kind of knew probably what was going through his mind, and he looks at me and he goes, so I watched your film last night. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, what did you feel? And he looks at me and he goes, man, how you're not holed up and like curled up in a ball in the fetal position in your bedroom, just not wanting to deal with life, how you are, because he had known me as a neighbor for 3 or 4 months at that time. So he saw me outside with the dogs talking about stuff, and oh yeah, I'm a filmmaker, oh yeah, I made this little documentary, blah, 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 blah. He just was astonished at how like normal I was. I mean, I use normal with air quotes for those of you putting air quotes around the word normal, because I'm most certainly not normal. But I think that when you talk about like things like trauma recovery, or you talk about going through these sort of incredible circumstances, extraordinary circumstances, and you do a lot of times have a choice in how you're going to respond. There's an author, and she's obviously very successful and did a very successful TED Talk named Brene Brown. She talks about shame in her TED Talk, the first TED Talk she did. And she, it's like shame. And I think that that's one of the things that really holds, I mean, I don't know why I'm launching this diatribe, by the way, so you can stop me at any point. But as I'm thinking about it, because we're talking about humor, I think that one of the things that trauma victims that people go through, like circumstances like myself, is there's this implied shame that comes with this, that they've done something somehow wrong, which is obviously when you're in an abusive situation, when you're dealing with narcissism, sociopathy, things like that. Like I dealt with my father, right? And I have my own issues from that still. But you have this like guilt and shame sort of thing that you need to like really pull through. And it's definitely easier this said than done. But I think once you start to embrace, and I think maybe she even talks about this, but you embrace the shame and you use it to empower you, then you can ultimately lead yourself through these circumstances, and you realize that like, okay, it's just like, they talk about in recovery, like 12-step programs or whatever, the guilt and shame of falling off the wagon, or, whereas the old adage, relapse is part of recovery, yada, yada, right? You think about things like that. But yeah, the guilt and shame is ultimately, I think, what keeps people in that sort of fear state of whether it's of the world or just their own personal experience, their own personal life, dealing with themselves, and like trying to carry through everyday tasks that a lot of us might consider like remedial or trite, but are a big deal for them, even so much as like going to the grocery store and interacting with people in crowds and things of that nature, right? And I think that humor and a little bit of that self-deprecation is definitely a great way to deal with that trauma response, and sort of ultimately lead you through that. My sort of spiel. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I apologize for going off on a tangent.
So we were thinking maybe if we could just start out with you sharing a little bit about your story. Just
Sure, I can give you the cliff notes. So when I was 11 years old, my parents were going through a divorce. And it all started because my father introduced me to what I ultimately found out was his girlfriend. He asked me to lie about it. I saw him kiss her in a romantic way. I told my mother about it. And what I didn't know is that my mother had known about my father's constant affairs for years. My father was a doctor. I grew up in a really small town called Mansfield, Ohio. And I guess that was like the line in the sand that she drew with him, is like, look, you can do whatever the fuck you want. You just, don't involve our son. And that was sort of their pact. Well, he involved me, and that was ultimately like the death rattle. And so she filed for divorce, and this nasty divorce sort of ensued. And my father, his mistress was pregnant, and it was a whole thing. And so I woke up in the middle of the night on December 31st, 1989, to a scream. And then I heard these two loud thuds that were probably about 90 seconds apart. And I was terrified. I was 11 years old at the time. And I heard my father muttering something. And then I heard the footsteps come down the hall, and I always, as a child, slept with my door open. I still do. And I saw these feet in the doorway, and I was like laying, and I could see out of my peripheral vision the feet that stopped in my doorway, and I was just telling myself, like, don't look up. Feet left. I ended up falling back asleep. I woke up the next morning. I immediately ran to my mother's bedroom, and my first thought was my mother was killed, and that I was looking for blood. Didn't find any blood. I noticed the sheets were all pulled off the bed. It was really weird. And I come downstairs, and my father's sitting on the couch. He had just taken a shower. He was watching CNN. And I said, "Where is my mother?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, Mommy took a little vacation, Collier." And then he proceeds to start telling me this whole story of how, I told him, I confronted him about the thuds, and he said that my mother had thrown her purse at him and threw her credit cards at him, and then came downstairs and was like yelling at him. I mean, the story was already evolving and changing at that point. And he, it said, you went into this whole sort of diatribe of like, look, we're not going to call the police. We're not going to call the FBI, which I thought was really weird. He said the FBI. I'm like, we're in a small town in Ohio, like, bro, like, come on. But his demeanor was really odd. And look, I grew up with my father being very violent. He was 6'3", 225 pounds, Italian, and he had he was like a rageaholic. Like, he had one of those tempers that would turn on at the drop of a hat out of nowhere. Like, anything would set him off. And he was very violent towards both myself and my mother, physically, verbally. The tirades were just insane, right? So I grew up in a lot of fear of my father, and I spent, I would say, the majority, like 95% of the time, with my mother. I was like her little sidekick, and she would, I guess, in lieu of a loving husband, I became like her person, right? So this happens, he leaves, and my mom had just bought a cordless phone at the time. I take the cordless phone, and my grandmother had come the night before on New Year's Eve, or the day before New Year's Eve, the 30th, had come to stay with us because she was going to spend New Year's with us. And this is my father's mother, who was extremely close to my mother. Like, people often thought that they were related. Like, this was her daughter, or even her way older sister, or way younger sister. They dressed alike, they went shopping, they just got along really well. My mother didn't have a previous relationship with her mother, so she got along really well with my grandmother, Christine. So I take the telephone, I run into the bathroom, and I call. I had saved these phone numbers in my Garfield. It was like a Santa Garfield. I put them in the hat of all my mom's friends. I called all of them, and I told them exactly what happened. I said, "You need to call the police." So they did. 2 uniformed officers came to the house. My grandmother was like really angry. They were there. "Your father said don't call the police, blah, blah, blah." I was like, "I don't know what happened," and I led the police through the house. They were uniformed officers in the black and white, and they took note. I didn't tell them everything because my grandmother was right there, but I kind of explained, and I pulled one of them aside. I said, "I don't trust my father as far as I could throw him." And he was like, "Oh, okay." So a day went by. There was nothing's happening, right? There's no more police coming to the house. And I'm like, okay, I've seen crime shows. Like, isn't there police? Isn't something supposed to happen when you call the police when someone's missing? And what happened is, I called my mother's friends. I said, "What's going on?" They go, "Oh, they're treating it as a missing persons case." And I'm like, it's not a fucking missing persons case. My mother is dead. Like, hello. So just by the grace of God, or whatever you want to call it, divine intervention, this detective at the Mansfield Police Department, because it was a holiday, things were kind of slow, he happened to see the missing persons report come across his desk. And he's like, "Oh, this is interesting. A doctor's wife, she goes missing on New Year's. This is super weird. There's 2 kids. It's the whole thing, right?" So he comes to the house, and my grandmother again will not let him in or whatever. And I'm like, "Oh, come on in." I opened the door and let him in the house. He's very charming and a nice guy. And, I just want to ask some questions and things of that nature. So he comes in the house, and I knew that this was my chance. And my mother used to tell me these stories when she was a kid of being on the carousel rides as a kid in the 1950s. And they had the brass ring that you would grab, right? And then you would win the prize, right? And my mother would always talk about grab the brass ring in life, Collier. I recognized right then and there that this was the brass ring. And I pulled Dave Massmore aside. I said, "Look at me." I said, "My mother is dead. My mother's been killed by my father. Nobody believed, this is what happened." I started, and he's just looking at me like I'm I'm crazy, but he he sort of believes me. So this is like this is January 1st, 1990. So New Year's Day, January 2nd, I go back to school. The first thing I do when I go back to school, so my mother's missing. Everyone knows her in the community. She was very active at my school, very active with the friends and the other kids. I go to the principal's office and I say, I need you, because he gave me his card and I hid it and said Garfield. And I gave her the card and I said, you need to call Dave Messmore right now and get him over here. Because I knew, okay, so my father, I'm away from my father, away from the family. I'm at school. That's my safety zone, right? So I know that for the 8 hours a day that I'm at school, like fuck schoolwork, fuck this and that, it's all about me figuring out what happened to my mother. So I get him there and I tell him the whole story about the divorce, the girlfriend, the like everything. And I tell him, I'm like, look, I'm gonna go home. I'm gonna, when my grandmother's downstairs dealing with my little sister, I'm gonna run upstairs, because I had an adopted sister that was adopted from Taiwan 6 months before my mom was killed. So she'll be dealing with her, and she was 3 years old at the time. She'll be dealing with her. I'm going to run upstairs. I'm going to pull the bookcases out and look in the crawl space behind the bookcases in the wall to see if I can find my mother's body. Like, these are the conversations that I'm having as an 11-year-old child with a place to stay.
Wow.
And I think, and he's just kind of like literally like, what the fuck? Like, who is this kid? Every day I'm at school, call Dave Messmore, get him down here. And I'm asking him, what are you doing? What's happening? But I'm so on it. And his captain, the police chief, was essentially like, this is a doctor. This is a doctor's wife. They're going through a divorce. She's pissed off. She left. That's it, Dave. And he's like, yeah, but this kid won't leave me alone. This little persistent kid. Turns out, so he's coming and I'm giving him more and more clues. I'm telling him about my father's behavior when my father comes home that night, because my father is off planning this new medical practice in Erie, Pennsylvania. He's going to go move and start this new practice in another state, right? So so I start reporting, like telling him all this stuff, like, hey man, like, he's come home and he had marks on his hands. And I'm like, my dad had these strange marks on his hands. My dad was really sore. He asked me to rub Ben Gay on his back because he was sore. He said he was moving stuff and this, that. And I mean, all this weird shit. So it's the middle of January, 1990. And I go with my father to his office to get some paperwork, and which was like not abnormal, right? On the way back to the house, he needs to get gas. We stop at a gas station and my father goes in to the gas station and I can see him as he's going in to pay for gas. And I immediately start rummaging through his truck while I can eyeball him. And I open up the center console and I find 2 Polaroid photographs. One is of a house and the second one is of his girlfriend / mistress sitting in front of a fireplace that's wrapped in plastic with her 2 kids that I knew. And I was like, bingo, this is something. And the next day is cool. Principal, call Dave Messmore, get him down here. I'm like, Dave, this is what I found. I found her, like, and I also like found her purse that she would always carry with her. Like, she had this one Dooney and Burke purse that was like very worn, that she loved, that she used all the time. That was at the house. I was like, she didn't leave. So like, this is more proof, guys, that she's dead. She's not coming back. Or my father has done something with her. I felt that she had been killed. But of course you're a child and you love your mother and she's your world and you don't really want to believe that, but you're like, she's dead. I knew it. Like, I knew from what I heard, I just knew it. So he goes, well, that's interesting. And he's telling about the house. Then around like January 19th, 20th, 21st of January 1990, my father says to me, he's getting super weird again. He's having these nightly meetings with his divorce lawyer, and they're putting up these signs outside the house that say no press, no, we're not answering questions, no police, blah, 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 all this stuff, right? I mean, you think when your wife is missing, you want to cooperate with people, right? They'd be like, oh, this is when I saw her. This is like this, it's super weird. And so it's already fishy. So my father says to me, he goes, Collier, I have a medical conference down in Florida. And I think we should go do a father-son trip. And now I had been several times with my father to medical conventions, and they were not in January. They're usually in the spring and fall or something. And so I had been able to swim since I was like 3 or 4 years old. So I go to school the next day and I say, Dave, my father wants me to go down to Florida, just me and him, as a father-son bonding trip for this medical conference. I am going to drown in the Gulf of Mexico. Get me the fuck out of my house. I think I used the F word at that time, but I was 11. But he got the point. I think he realized that like this might be the sole witness to a murder, and this guy's dad I don't put it past him to like kill his son, because I think my dad had realized at that point, like the house, the fact that the police are still asking questions, that like something's like, I'm the one who's like secretly talking to the police at school and giving them all this info that they would not have known because they wouldn't have had access to me. Right. And I'm just like, nope, this is what's happening. So I'm basically like with Dave, like doing this investigation. And the morning of January 24th, 1990, two strangers show up in my bedroom, 6 a.m. They're like, you have 20 minutes to pack a bag and we're getting out of here. I'm like, what about my dog? They're like, we'll come back for your dog. Pack a bag, just get the essentials. You're leaving. And they were with Child Protective Services. As I'm coming down the stairs, the entire house is flooded with men in lab coats, all these gadgets, everything. Like the crime lab is there. They're full on. Like, we're looking for this body. Turns out, so I go to like my principal's house that day, and just like hanging to like wait and see what happens. They end up getting a search warrant for this house, which is in Erie, Pennsylvania. And that night, at the same time that I'm having probably I was asthmatic as a kid, like heavily asthmatic, as I'm having probably what I thought I was going to die that night of an asthma attack. At the same time, they were pulling my mother's body out of the basement floor of this house. My father had dug a hole with a jackhammer in the basement because he had just bought this house, dug a hole in the basement floor, buried her, put her body in there, covered it with concrete, covered it with AstroTurf, like indoor outdoor carpeting, had custom shelves built in there and everything repainted. And they had secured this search warrant for this house. And then they were like sort of in there going, where is this? And then this one guy from like the Erie Police Department or something, or maybe it was Dave, I can't remember. I mean, I wasn't there obviously, but somebody noticed a splatter on the wall, like a small little like couple inch long splatter or something. They're like, that's super weird. And then they like get a shovel. And they're walking and they're like, maybe. And then they just rip it up. And there was like as they start to pull up the carpet, they can smell a little bit of an odor. It doesn't smell like fresh concrete. And then they're like, they see the outline of the hole and they're like, yeah, this is it. And they dug my mother's body up. So I go on the next morning to the hospital for this breathing treatment. And I remember being shut. It was weird because the whole lobby of the hospital was filled. And there was an honor box, the old where they had the newspapers in, and they like, as I'm walking towards the honor box, like somebody like veers me over, like, so I don't see it. I remember thinking to myself, like, that's super weird. Like, why couldn't I walk that way? Okay. And then they gave me the breathing treatment in the hospital, and then the principal of my school, she said, Collier Lieutenant Messmore found your mom. It was like an eternity, probably lasted a second and a half. And she said, and she was dead. And the first thing out of my mouth was, that bastard. Like, I knew my father murdered my mother. I was like, and as horrible as that moment was, it's the worst moment of my life. I also had this like overwhelming sense of relief that like, well, I was right. Mommy did, because at the same time, like, as horrible as that is, you also don't want to think your mother abandoned you, who's been your rock and who loves you. Like, it's a really weird dichotomy. I know that some listeners that are probably going like, dude, what the fuck, man? Like, but the thing is that like you have this sort of sense of like, okay, mommy didn't leave me, mommy was forced to leave me, and with my mother, it was really difficult, and I was very emotional, but I was also just like, okay, like now I have to deal with the aftermath of this, but okay, this stage of the this stage of the race is done. Now we're on to the next stage. And what ensued was just a fucking fiasco. I was in a small town of 25,000, 30,000 people in the county. it happened in like the body was found in another state, so it crossed state lines, so it became like national news, and at least like in the tri-state area, it was like the biggest news story. It was like the crime of the century in my town. And the trial and all of the evidence against my father was circumstantial. There was no blood, there were no fibers, there was no nothing, because you figure that she was murdered on December 31st. They found her body on January 25th, that morning, early morning hours of January 25th. And then they arrested my father at my house in Mansfield after that. There was plenty of time to clean up all this stuff, right? So it then sort of fell on me, and not that anybody put this on me, because I was very willing to do this. Like, I'm literally leading this investigation with giving them everything I can to try to solve this. And then like I had to testify at the grand jury and to secure my father's indictment for murder. So testify at the grand jury, and so they indict him based on my testimony. And then this weird thing happens where, okay, I'm in a temporary sort of home for a second. Where are my relatives? Well, my father's side of the family was very convinced that I was putting my father in prison, so they were like, fuck you. And my mother's side of the family literally said to me verbatim, this is my mother's sister, she said to me, we can't take you because you look like your father.
Wow.
Which, for the record, the only thing it looks like, the only looks that I have of my father's is I'm male and I'm tall. That's it. I look like my mother, like dead ass. So it is, not only have I been betrayed by my father, I've lost the most important person in my life. My whole world's been turned upside down. And now my family, godfather and godmother on both sides of the family, are like, go fuck yourself. Go to the wolves. So I was then put into the foster care system. And that was a nightmare, to say the least. And I ended up, I testified at the trial was in June of 1990. I testified for 2 days against my father in court. And what the interesting thing is, sort of aggravating as well, is like when ID came out with the film, right? And they put a little blurb, you can look online, and it says, the son gave videotape testimony. I'm like, no. I testified in court and stared my father down while I'm testifying. And there were all these things where people said, oh, you were clearly coached because you were so poised and so intelligent on the witness stand. Like, how could you do this? It's like, no, I wasn't fucking coached, because if you're coached, you're when you're testifying for 2 days under cross-examination, you're probably going to, I was 12. Like, of course you're going to buckle. Of course you're not going to be able to remember shit. And I tell people the easiest thing in the world to remember and recite ad nauseum, like rote by rote, is the truth, because it's the easiest thing to remember. So when it's so pure it flows, it's the truth. And there was a lot of speculation for years. There's still a speculation of like, oh, well, you did this. And I was like, no, that was me. And that's what happened, But, at the same time, like, here I am, this little boy who has lost the most important person in his life. I have like no real contact with anyone, no family to support me. And the one person that would literally be able to support me through all of this is not there for me. And it was really scary. And the thing that I was facing too is, my life is, as I know it, is over. So there's that. On top of that, my options are either A, testify and do the right thing, which is what I was always going to do anyways, obviously. But the outcome of that is that I lose my father as well, or that my father gets off, because he had a whiz bang, a team of lawyers defending him, and he gets off, and then I go back into his custody, and he makes the rest of my life a living hell. Like, he was already a violent and aggressive and angry person with me, and very, very, very abusive. Like, what do you think when you're like, oh, my kid tried to put me in prison, you're Italian, and that, like, that whole thing. I mean, come on. It's like, just, it's there are no good options here. But I just had to really find the courage in myself to just, when you're staring at the nadir of your life, you got to make a choice. And my choice was, it's really weird. And I don't mean to go off on a tangent, but I made the film as a filmmaker because I wanted to tell my story, my mother's story. I wanted to honor, like, that's why I moved to Hollywood. That's like everything I've done. Like I literally was thinking about it the other day because I do a podcast. I'm talking about this more and more and more, right? And people were like, "Well, you're really driven. Your tenacity is just something that is just so crazy. Like your tenacity when you're a kid." I was like, "Yeah." I was like, I realized the other day I have not taken my foot off the gas pedal since I was 11. My foot has never been off the gas pedal. And somebody sent me this quote. And I'm trying not to get emotional. Somebody sent me this quote. They follow me on social media, and they said the quote says, "People who've been through like unspeakable trauma often have a fire that burns inside them is inextinguishable." And sorry, for me that's true. Like I took that and I just didn't stop. I still don't stop, right? And it's that's what I had to do as a kid, is I just had to say, this is it. This is for all this is for all the marbles, this is it. This is it sucks. This is what your choice is, but like, you can either stand up and do what's right and be able to look yourself in the mirror till you take your last breath on this earth, or you don't. Like, that's it. Those are your choices, buddy.
Yeah.
Like, sorry that you don't have another option. Sorry, there's no timeout. But like, this is the fourth quarter. You're down by 3. Make the shot and make the foul shot. Like, that's it. And it's like, it's sorry, I had to use a basketball analogy because it's the NBA right now. So of course I did. But the thing is when you're faced with those decisions, it's just, and I'm saying this because I've just been thinking about this lately, like in the last week when I talk to other survivors and I talk about like these things on TikTok or on my social media, various social media and the podcast and things, is that I realize like I'm so fucking grateful that I did that, because it is literally, when I was talking about the neighbor who said, you went through this, and like how you're not holed up in a room, in your like in a fetal position. The reason why is because I literally made a fucking choice right then and there that like, this is what I'm going to do, for better or for worse. Whatever happens, I'm going to die trying. I will die on this fucking hill regardless. Like, I might as well give it the like, leave it all out on the floor, and that's the thing, is like, that is why I'm not sitting in a room in a fetal position curled up, because I did everything I could from that moment on to honor my mother, to make sure that justice was served, to put the man who ended her life behind prison, where he still is to this day. As we're speaking, my father is still incarcerated. He just turned 79 last month. And I think that's one of the things that I'm probably the most grateful for, is that I made that decision. And we're done with this podcast, and I go outside and I drop dead of a brain aneurysm or heart attack or whatever, God forbid. But I can literally know that I did everything I needed to do. Like, I have at total peace with my life. I mean, there's many things that I want to do, and there's many creative things, and I'm a filmmaker and an artist, and many things that I really want to do. But like, at the end of the day, it's like, I did it. Like, I can look back on my life and go, I gave it all. I gave everything I could to do what was right, to raise awareness for these types of things, to honor most importantly, to honor my mother, and to not let her death go in vain, to let this be something that inspires. Because, I made a documentary with a 2-time Oscar winner for documentaries, who's a amazing filmmaker that will live on the annals of history, that it's evergreen. Like, you see the film and you are able to relate to it. It transcends time and space, and it's like, you can just relate to the power of the human spirit.
What a testament to your mother, and what kind of a person she must have been, and what kind of an amazing relationship y'all must have had, for you to not only go to any lengths to ensure that justice was done for her, but that your life is about that now. Your life is about telling her story. And for me, I have one son, and it's just, those are special relationships, in my opinion. And I would be so thrilled to know that my son didn't let anyone forget me, and that's just, your life is like just a just speaking about her all the time. And that's amazing to me.
And thank you for that. But it goes beyond that, because it's not just about her, because what it is that, like, I've told that story, but it's also to like learn compassion and grace that leads you through life and leads you, the podcast is called Moving Past Murder. So I am moving past that, right? And I am doing it in a way that is fulfilling to me, that honors her spirit. You know what I mean? I don't necessarily have to talk about her all the time. And the craziest thing is, I have reconnected with relatives that I never even knew existed. They are like second cousins and things of that nature. And they listen to the podcast, or they discover me. They saw the New York Post article. Yeah. So these family members have reached out. They discovered me via TikTok, like a couple months ago. And I wasn't even really posting actively on TikTok. I just had a couple of things up there, but they found me and then they reached out, and I was like, "Oh, you do TikTok?" Because I wasn't even really on TikTok at that time. And they watch they see the podcast, like, because I do it on, I do it on all the audio platforms, and I film it too because I'm a filmmaker. So it's like nothing for me. It's like, if I'm going to record it, I might as well do the video too and put it on my YouTube channel. And the amazing thing is, these people see it and they're like, "You are so much like your mother." It's like a spitting image. And that is so amazing to hear.
Yeah.
That these people are like, "Oh my God, you're like a carbon copy. Your mannerisms, that your the way you speak, the way you interact, your so overall energy." They're like, "This is why people loved your mother so much." And people that only met her a couple of times, like, people have reached out to me and they see the film, or they've heard the podcast, or both, and they've reached out to me via social media and said, "I remember I met your mother once. She came in to like, this guy worked at Brooks Brothers, and the clothing store in Columbus, Ohio, at the city center, and he talked about, like, my mom came in there and bought something from him, and just how memorable she was in their one interaction, of just how cool she was, how poised and put together, and just how kind she was. And then he had read a couple months later that she was murdered, and he was like, he started crying, because he was like, this he's like, "I knew this woman for all of 25 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever our interaction was, but I could tell that she was a light in the world that someone extinguished far before its time." He just, and then he saw the film, discovered me, was like, "Oh my God, like, this is how I remember your mother." Like, that is so rewarding to hear. I mean, I think I probably do all these things just to get that sort of, just to sort of discover these things. Like, I'm sort of rediscovering the person that my mother was, that I didn't know because I was a child, and I knew these things, growing up. And you talk about it as a testament to my mother. And there's ways that my mother, I mean, both my parents were very educated. They went to Penn, my entire family from Philadelphia went to Penn, as a matter of fact. And they so education had a very high value. Is that the right words? And as someone who comes from an educated background, can't articulate your words, grammatical decay has already set in. But like, they place such a high value on education and the way that I was treated. And people said to me after the film, that know me, that work in the fields of psychology and psychiatry, they're like, especially those that work with trauma, they're like, the way that your mother raised you, because she treated you like a little adult, like, when you went through this traumatic experience where you're essentially dropped, you bounced back. You didn't go to fight or flight. You bounced back into your frontal cortex, like the limbic system, where you're in a thought process, and you're focused and you're goal oriented. Right? Am I correct on that?
Yeah.
Okay. And I talk about it in my TED talk too, so I hope I'm right. But you're able to think and rationalize and not panic, and that's why you were here. We were because of how she treated you, because she didn't baby talk me. She didn't do, like, she was very kind and loving, but she was also very, very, my mother was very, very strict and very, like, no, like, children to be seen and not heard, and it was, and ultimately that laid the foundation of that resilience mindset that I have, and I still carry with me to this day. And it's incredible, and I'm very grateful for it. I also, I say very sarcastically, but like, people were like, "Well, how did you focus on all the stuff with your mother and your father and put all this together, all these clues, I was like, well, this is what happens when you're the last kid in your friend group to get a Nintendo. Like, this is what happens. Because I literally got a Nintendo the Christmas before she died. Like, literally, that's when I got a Nintendo. I had Nintendos for like 5 years before that. She's like, now you're getting a Nintendo, and I'm buying it in front of you and putting it in the closet until Christmas. I was like, okay.
That's awesome.
We sure hope that you enjoyed part 1 of our conversation with Collier Landry, and we hope that you will join us for part 2 next week.
And as always, don't forget that knowledge leads to a life lived better. Thank you for listening to Life Lived Better with Paula and Joseph.